Hi guys, welcome to another video. This time I will be talking about my new album Dreams Long Forgotten and how I wrote it. This album was such a roller coaster. Yeah, I can't resist it. And it really was a bit of a roller coaster because so many things happened that I wasn't really planning for. Wasn't even planning on writing this album in the first place. It just somehow happened. But yeah, it came out of procrastination on other projects, and life is whatever happens while you're busy making other plans. So I was actually planning to write a different album, an album on my modular, and that didn't really work out so well. I wrote a bunch of tracks, but I quickly realized that maybe I had made my modular a little bit too versatile. Previously, it usually was enough to just limit myself to an instrument and then it would turn out coherent anyway. But my modular is so versatile that it started to go in 3 or 4 different directions at once, and I couldn't get it coherent. Instead of one album, I ended up with 2 EPs and a couple of tracks that don't fit anywhere, and yeah, this was hugely frustrating for me because I didn't really have such problems before. Yeah, my modular can do all sorts of different things. There are oscillators in there, sample playing, there's also effects in there, and just by saying I'm gonna use the modular, that's not a coherent line for the album yet. I would have to restrict myself in some other ways, and I didn't do that. So it went in many different directions at once, and yeah, that didn't work out, and I was very frustrated, and it was all taking way too long. So what do you do when you ran your project straight into the wall and have like 3 projects instead of 1? Well, the most obvious solution is, of course, to start another one, right? Yeah, no, not exactly sensible life choices here, I know. But I was frustrated, so I was just looking for a way out, and I was procrastinating, so here we are. At the time, I was reading this book here. It's called Limit Yourself and Unleash Your Creativity. And that resonated with me insofar as I was feeling a bit too unconstrained. So I decided that I would make a little experiment and start a project that limits itself to something much more simple than that guy over there. I was focusing on Ableton Live because I was really familiar with it. I thought maybe that would go a bit more quickly than what I was trying to do before. And I also restricted myself in just using mostly Ableton stock instruments. So I wanted to restrict myself to instruments that I hadn't really explored in much detail yet, like all the physical modeling synthesizers in Ableton, collision, electric, those sorts of things. And I also wanted to use drift a bit more. At the time, I was also very much interested in the Ableton Move. It was a really interesting bit of hardware, and I really liked the integration with Ableton. I thought it would be such a sensible tool for me to use. I had a bit of gas, so I thought, yeah, I shouldn't just buy this. Instead, I should try out Ableton Note app, and if that works for me, then probably Ableton Move would also work for me. So at least one part of this was at least somewhat sensible. I didn't just buy a new Groovebox just because, I was more sensible than that and was using Ableton Note app on the iPad, and of course also Ableton Drift on Ableton itself. And with these restrictions, I thought I would get something a bit more coherent than my other project that wasn't going so well and had turned into 3 projects, maybe 4. I'm not quite sure yet. Yeah, I know. I know. The instruments weren't really the reason why I started this project though. I had found an old SD card of mine with field recordings from before the pandemic, and while I was listening to them, it felt like, yeah, someone else recorded it. I'm not like that anymore. And I remember how I felt, and it was sort of strange to remember it. I felt like I was maybe a little bit naive before. I didn't really see what would happen. I didn't really see it coming. And I mean, who saw the pandemic coming? I didn't anticipate how people would react. And I really wasn't prepared for all the calls to just let people die to reopen businesses. I don't think anyone really expected that, but it happened a lot. And I was experiencing that every day during the pandemic. And that profoundly changes you. I have a very different opinion and outlook on humanity now because of that. Looking back on the person who was making these field recordings was like looking towards a very young, very naive version of myself, even though that now seems also a bit of a cynical thing to say. But I was very different then and not prepared for any of that. I guess that was the reason why I really wanted to do something with these recordings. There was something about memory in there, about how it used to be, a bit of nostalgia and a wish to go back to how the world was before and how I was before and so on. And this sparked memories from childhood and how I was then and what kind of aspirations and dreams I had and what I wanted to do with my life. And all of these sorts of feelings came out through these field recordings just because there was such a disconnect to them. I got really excited about this project, and the difficult one with the modular kind of went out the window because I didn't want to solve the problems that it had. So starting a new project is always much more exciting than struggling for an older one, and I just jumped straight into it, so yeah. I also wanted to explore some techniques with this. I had been going through Ableton again and trying to figure out all the functions that I hadn't really explored in depth yet. And while I was looking through the interface, I found this crossfader. I don't know whether you know that it is there. It's part of the DJ functions, I guess. I had never found it before. I had never realized that it was even there. I wanted to try whether I could integrate it into my workflow. With the crossfader function, you can transition and go from one thing to a completely different thing. And I wanted to play around with that a bit. I also wanted to explore the resampling function a bit more. I have resampled a lot in the past, mostly by re-recording through effects. But in this case, you can just re-record stuff, resample stuff from within Ableton really easily and quickly. You can solo something and just re-record that through one effect or two. It makes it really simple to re-record and then warp it and change it and create variations through that. That was something that I really wanted to try out a bit more. So for resampling, of course, I used effects. Most of the effects that I wanted to use were stock Ableton effects, and I only used a couple more that were different from that. And there was only Valhalla Supermassive, which I always use because it's very washy and you can have these really crazy long tails and create proper space type reverb. It's really fun and it's free, so that's even better. Another effect that I really wanted to try out was Pitch Loop 89. It's part of the Ableton Suite version, and I wanted to try it out because I had ordered a Mood Mark II and it hadn't arrived yet, but I really wanted to play with something like that. And Pitch Loop 89 is not so different from the Mood in the feel of it. It has a similar digital glitch effect in many ways. You can mimic Mood a little bit, and that's why I wanted to use it while I was waiting for my new pedal to arrive. Once the Mood arrived, I used that too, and I specifically recorded Ableton Note app through the Mood into Ableton on my laptop, and that was my way of re-recording and resampling too. These were of course very digital, and the synthesizer instruments that I used were also quite digital. I mean, physical modeling and even the analog model that is in Ableton doesn't sound extremely analog to me, to be honest. So for me it was all a bit too digital, too harsh. So I used tape effects too. One of the effects was audio thing wires. That is also plastered all over Hypnagogia, my second album. So I'm very familiar with it, and I like it very much. I try to use proper tape effects too, like I did on previous albums, and that's how I started out. But the problem was that all my tape recorders turned out to be broken. I tried my dictaphone one night and that didn't work, so I tried all my dictaphones and they were all broken. Then I tried my Walkman and yeah, none of them worked anymore. So I was very frustrated with that. The only tape deck that still works in this household now is my Yamaha multi-track. I actually used a trick that I found already while I was recording Hypnagogia. If you record into the Yamaha multi-track with a microphone that is not really meant for recording voice, like a harmonica microphone, then it does sound more like a dictaphone. I have a Shure 520DX for this purpose, and that's also what I use to re-record some bits on one track and on this album. Of course, my Yamaha actually works quite well. It doesn't warble, so to get that effect, I put wires on it and dialed it in just the way I liked it to get the precise effect that makes it sound like a dictaphone. And that worked really well for me, and it created exactly the effect that I wanted. So in the end, it wasn't so bad that all my dictaphones were broken. I could do what I wanted anyway by using a bit more of a predictable effect through the Yamaha. It's of course sad that all these old recorders tend to break. I feel like whenever I try to record something with a dictaphone, it doesn't work anymore. Whenever that happens, I order a new one of eBay, and then when I try it out, it actually works. It's probably kind of broken, but it still works. I record one thing with it, and then when I get back to it, maybe half a year later, it's also broken and doesn't work anymore. I don't know, maybe it's the humidity in this place, but I definitely can't really rely on dictaphones working in this environment. So wires is a godsend because of that. Another staple for me that I practically use on all my albums is my favorite shimmer effect, and you would now expect that this would be my expensive Polara pedal, but no, it's not necessarily that. My favorite is actually completely free. If you use a pitch shifter and run that through a reverb with long tails, then you get a shimmer effect. And what I use is a free one called Guitar Gadgets. There is an effect in there that is called Niagara Falls, and that has long reverb tails. So I just crank the effect and then put a pitch shifter on there. I use a kilohertz one. I can recommend that, and it's free too. So that's a neat little trick that I always use, and I actually resampled a lot through just the shimmer by turning off the dry sound completely and recording just the shimmer and then doing things to it, running it through more effects or warping it, and that really worked well. Since I used field recordings in this, I should probably also mention my field recorder. I use a Tascam DR100 Mark III, and this is the field recorder that I bought when I started making YouTube videos. I actually bought it to record voice, but I always wanted a proper field recorder. I used to have real problems field recording in the past. I couldn't really afford any recorders when I started out, and I tried to do field recordings on dictaphones. You can imagine how well that worked. It didn't. that still cracks me up, but it was so lo-fi and funny that it was sometimes quite cool too. I don't really have any of those recordings anymore, but yeah, back then that was my thing because I couldn't really afford anything else. For a little while I also used a mini disc recorder, but I couldn't really afford a proper microphone, so I was always running into this issue of not being able to get the field recordings I wanted. So when I started my YouTube channel, I bought a field recorder in the style that I always dreamed of, and the DR100 Mark III is actually very nice. It doesn't have 32-bit float, so it could use with some upgrading, but I still use it for every video I'm recording on it right now. It has Omni microphones and cardioid, and they sound quite nice, and the preamps are not very noisy either, so I quite like it. It's not perfect, and I think I will upgrade eventually to a 32-bit recorder, but it's very nice anyway, and that's what I used when I took all the field recordings that I worked with in this project. I mostly used cardioid capsules for many of the more specific sounds. One of the tracks, Maria's Vivas, has a lot of bird sounds on it, and nature sounds from the nature preserve around here. And those I recorded with the cardioid capsule. And for many of the ambiences, I normally use the Omni microphones, depending on whether there is a motorway nearby. Here the nature preserve is practically surrounded by motorways, so you can't really use Omni mic so well, and that sometimes creates problems. And the cardioid capsules on this one are okay-ish, but not great. So eventually I want to upgrade, but back then I had just started my channel and I was recording things while I was recording videos, and it wasn't really so focused yet that I even thought about improving my microphones. So I just used what I had, and that was this nice recorder and the internal microphones. I also used the Zoom H6 at some point, but surprisingly not for the field recordings. I was using the Zoom to record the mood and Ableton Note app, and I was doing that because I was playing around with the mood, and once you have recorded something into it, if you turn it off, then the buffer gets erased, and so I had to record whatever I had before unplugging it. And I ended up recording a lot of the elements that I recorded from Ableton Note app with the Zoom downstairs instead of here at the desk in the studio. I think a lot of this album was actually not written at the desk. It was written on the laptop and on the sofa, and since my desk project wasn't really going so well, I was just frustrated and wanted to try something different. And it worked, I suppose, since I actually finished this album. By now I have actually made a lot of progress on the modular stuff, and I have at least one album already done that came out of this project, so it's not all that bad. I didn't just abandon it. But yeah, this one was more of a, I can't deal with my issues, so I do this instead. And don't get me wrong, I love making music with the modular, but it sometimes gets a bit too complicated when you're recording one element and then another, and you have to repatch, and it takes me a lot longer to come up with a patch on the modular than with an element in Ableton. So it's just much more immediate to work in the box. If someone tells you that hardware will make you more productive, then I call bullshit on that, because it just means that you have to record a lot, and it's a lot more inconvenient, and you can't just duplicate things, you have to do it differently, and yeah, it's not that easy to work with hardware. It slows you down a lot, so sometimes it's nice to just work in the box, and it's much more efficient in that way. This is also why this project is now finished and the other one isn't, because it was just much easier to make. The other stuff is also almost done, but I still need to record bits and pieces here and there, and that slows me down, and then I procrastinate on finishing it. I think you're noticing a theme by now. I put the pro in procrastination, so So a lot of the inspiration for the different tracks came out of the field recordings. I would slow some of them down or pitch shift them. And there was one field recording of a cement mixer that turned into whale sounds. It started this whole imagination of a creature, a marine creature, coming to the surface. I was wondering why it would come to the surface, and of course the reasons are obvious. Pollution in the seas, noise pollution in the seas. It's very loud in the sea now, and of course there's all this plastic, and there are many different reasons for a creature to come to shore and to get away from the sea. And none of them have anything to do with wanting to be around humans, I suppose. At least not in my mind. And I still had this feeling that I wanted it to be sort of dazzling when it comes to the surface. I had this memory of a field recording that I took near Barcelona in a place called Premià de Mar. We were there for a photo festival where I had a picture hanging a few years ago. There's actually a video on my channel. It's quite old, so a little different in style. You can see me field recording there, recording this harbour. I remembered these bell-like sounds from the masts of the ships and boats there. And I thought that would be quite fitting to represent dazzling light on the surface when the creature comes to shore. And when I actually went back to listen to the recording, there were no bell-like sounds. It sounded actually far more ominous, and it was sort of these clicking sounds, not really like what I had imagined. So in the end, I decided to stay true to my memory rather than the recording, and made the bell sound in Ableton's Collision, and that worked really well. Another inspiration was a melody that I also probably misremembered, because it was something that I heard in a dream. I woke up and very confused. I laid down the melody as I remembered it. And of course, when you're still half asleep, you're trying to put something down, you play wrong notes, or you don't quite get it the first time around, and then a part of the melody fades, and what came out of it was probably not the melody that I had heard in that dream. But I quite liked it, so I turned it into a track too. So there was a lot of misremembered stuff, and the feeling of looking back at a time that doesn't exist anymore. It turned out really dreamy and otherworldly because of it. And I really like that, because it feels like something half remembered from childhood, perhaps. While I was making it, and because I was also putting a lot of tape effects on there to hide the digitalness of some of the effects and the instruments, it felt like an old tape that I found in some box somewhere with old recordings and half remembered stuff. And it was really fitting that in the end something serendipitous happened. Just as I was finishing this album and I had just finished all the mixes, I was wondering about where to place it, and I approached a couple of labels and I wasn't really hearing much back from them. So I was a bit lost as to where to place it, because it's again one of those albums that fits squarely nowhere. It is neither really ambient, and it's also not dark ambient. It's somewhere in the middle, and it's too dark for ambient labels and not dark enough for dark ambient labels, so they're all a bit like, not sure what to do with this. It's nice, but maybe try somewhere else. So that's usually the reaction that I get when I try to place things with labels, because I don't really fit into neat categories. And in this case, I got really lucky, because just as it was done, Alberto from El Manto Records got in touch and asked whether I would be interested in working with them. And I had just finished this album, so I sent this album over to him, and he liked it a lot. So it came about as a tape release, and it is just so perfect.
Yes, I'm very happy.
When I was listening to it for the first time, it literally gave me goosebumps, because it was exactly the way I imagined it while I was making it. It just sounded exactly like I wanted it to sound, and I was so happy about that. So thanks to Alberto for the great mastering. It's really wonderful, and it turned out lovely. If you're interested in the tapes, the first limited edition run actually sold out within a week, which is amazing. There are still some copies left at the time of recording of the regular release edition. So if you want to have one of the tapes, then check out the link in the description where you can buy it. I would suggest that you check it out sooner rather than later, because the pre-order limited edition really went super fast, so I wouldn't really rely on it being available for a very long time. But if you're not interested in the tape, there's digital too, and that will never run out, so that will always be available. If you enjoyed the video, then please leave a like. and subscribe if you haven't done so already. It really helps out my channel, so I would really appreciate it. You can also support this channel on Ko-fi if you want to see more of these more complicated projects, because your support on Bandcamp and Ko-fi makes this all possible, and I'm very grateful for all the support you've already shown for this album. It's really heartwarming and it means a lot to me. So thank you so much for that. In any case, I hope I will see you soon for another video. Bye!